Hello, this will be the second video of the critical essay course, and I just wanted to clear the air and clarify a few details about the guidelines for the critical essay that you will be writing, because I had sent an email that might have created more confusion than clarification. So here's one attempt to clear that. And I'll just say, in addition to this video, and I'll speak again on the topic many times in our synchronous classes, this information can also be found in our shared Google Drive folder in an essay called Critical Essay Guidelines, which I excerpted in our recent email. And that, if you can't find it, please let me know, because that will be referring to that throughout the semester. So I just wanted to explain your options and just let you know that there is certainly, from my perspective, lots of flexibility and opportunity to work within and between and a little bit outside of these three options. These three options for the critical essay are the options described by the powers that be, meaning other instructors of the critical essay and the director of this program. So I'm in agreement with Rita, but I think that I might be able to work with you a little bit outside of these three options. Just know that she and others will be reading your critical essay alongside your thesis. So your thesis advisor, whoever that might be that you've chosen, will have very specific and particular ideas about the critical essay. And they'll certainly be focusing on your thesis and the content of your thesis, but since this will be included, Rita will be reading it and wants to emphasize, and I agree, the formatting should be either following the Chicago Manual of Style rules and guidelines or the MLA Handbook of Style for formatting. So we'll cover that in class. I think some of you mentioned you hadn't necessarily worked with those rules before, so we'll cover that. And I do believe as well that in thesis seminar, that's some material that should be covered, and I will write to I'll write to Erin and Justin, whoever is teaching the other thesis seminar. So I'll write to them and say, hey, let's all cover this briefly, the MLA formatting and the Chicago Manual of Style, just so that no one's left out and misses that information somehow. It's also pretty widely available on the webs if you want to get started looking at that. But that's just a minor detail about the formatting. In terms of the options that you have for how to write and what to write for your critical essay, again, I'll just say this is the beginning of the semester. Most of the first third of the semester will be reading widely in the genre, just to give you inspiration and examples. So if right now you're thinking, as you listen to the three options, if you're thinking, I don't know really what that means, or I've never read an essay like that, or that's not what I want to write, don't worry, we'll be reading in each of these categories, and then we'll also be finding a few essays that don't really fit into those three, but how we could imagine that they do, or how we could push your work into one of these three options. So the first would be, and again, this is, I'm sort of reading from the Google Doc called Critical Essay Guidelines that I've just edited and have incorporated a few recent suggestions from Rita. So the first option would be that the critical essay can look outward into the field of creative writing by focusing on craft topics, aesthetic or thematic issues, genres, and styles of texts by other writers that the MFA WP student has found especially inspiring. Students should do close readings of and analyze and unpack key texts and themes, and state what they are learning from each text or author. So I'm going to use my whiteboard because I have one, and it's probably not going to be that useful for this particular class, but I want to get out of my seat. So the first option for the critical essay would be intertextual. So basically thinking about your writing and how it relates, either how it's inspired by or influenced by another book, or perhaps by a school of thought, or one specific author. And this could be sort of a comparison or contrast. I'm not very good at writing while I talk. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. And also, just to simplify it, basically your writing and the writing of others. And it could be contemporary, it could be historical, it could be a survey, it could be an era, it could be one author. Someone in our recent class, Molly or Darla, I can't remember who it was that brought this up, asked about comp titles. This would be a similar approach, basically saying like, I'm writing this book or project for my thesis, and you don't have to say for my thesis. I'm just letting you know, related to your project, because many of you are not writing theses because you're in the certificate program. And my apologies for often talking about the thesis of many of you. I recognize that not all of you are writing theses because you are in a different program. My apologies. But anyway, so you're writing a project or you're writing a manuscript, and you want to say, this is the state of the field, or this is the contemporary literary market. Here are 2 books that are either similar in genre or style or form or approach or theme, and here's how my work fits into that, into those comp titles, how they compare. So that's the first option. And I also have some examples here of books and essays that I think would fit into that category. One would be the book that I used last year for the critical essay that I love, and I considered assigning it again because it was a perfect book for the class, but I just wanted to mix things up for myself and use different texts. But I highly recommend this book. I'll talk about it a few times throughout the semester, and I might give you an excerpt. So it's Lori Moore, See What Can Be Done, Essays, Criticism, and Commentary. So this book it's a collection of her essays. It's all about all sorts of things: culture, politics, economics. But the bulk of the book, that's a tongue twister, contains book reviews and analyses of texts and other prose and poetry, and so mostly book reviews. So she writes about other writers, other authors, other texts, and in all of those she brings in some element of basically her work and her life, and they're not personal essays, but she basically gives the reader an idea for context why she is the right person for the job, meaning why has she chosen to review this book or this collection of books? What's her interest? How does she connect to these? Does she resonate with them? Does she not like them, and for this reason? A typical book review includes more than just does this book work or not. It contextualizes the book in history and also in relation to the author of the book review. So that's sort of how Lori Moore's book would exemplify this first option of the critical essay looking outward into the field of creative writing. Another example would be Eudora Welty, who was a Southern writer contemporary with Flannery O'Connor and writing mostly short fiction and also some creative nonfiction. And this book it's a wonderful short, you would be able to read it in a day, book about the act of writing fiction and a career in writing fiction, and also it's actually maybe a segue into the next section because there's a little gray area between these. This book, she writes about other authors, so that would exemplify this first idea, basically reviewing and analyzing other writers, but also her own writing. And if you focus on analyzing the craft and techniques of your own writing, that would be along the lines of option 2, which is, I'll read this here, the critical essay can examine one's own creative work. Here, writers should make a cogent argument about their aesthetic values and demonstrate, through close readings and analysis, how their writing has evolved and found its voice or aesthetic over the last 2 years. So that's quite specific. I didn't write that, but I feel like over the last 2 years can be extended to just your recent involvement in the world of creative writing and the act of creative writing. So just rather than saying like, when I was 5, I wrote poems in crayon, just recent, the last few years. It doesn't have to be just the last 2 years. That's just a suggestion that the person who wrote this paragraph included. Could also be thought of as your career at BCFA. So I'll put that on our list here on the board. More of a self-reflecting of your own craft analysis. One's own writing. Craft, technique, and voice. There are other examples, but I think, how you came into a certain technique or form, or basically why you're writing the way that you write now, or why you're writing the content that you're writing now. So I had one example for that category in the sense that Eudora Welty does write about her own work in here and analyzes why and how and what's the context and what are her reasons philosophically, aesthetically, etc. for writing what she writes. Another example in this general category of writing about one's own writing can also include some more personal essay style, lyrical essay, creative essay, such as Annie Dillard's work. And this, if anyone has not read this, I would highly recommend this as well. The Writing Life, in which she includes a lot more pastoral, natural, and personal reflection on her own writing. So I'll just give you an example. One specific example, that there are so many that I was struggling to pick one. She observes in this book, in one of the chapters, and it's like one extended essay, it's all connected. She observes the flight path of a trick pilot, someone who flies a plane for and the aesthetics of the smoke. So Obviously, I'm not an expert. I don't even know what to call it. I think it's a trick pilot. Anyway, she's observing the smoke signals and the lines that the plane creates in the sky, and it makes her reflect on her line making, meaning writing, and what it means to her, and connecting to this person's profession, the pilot, and how it's really an art form that he's able to have the skill to fly this plane. And then it allows her to reflect on her own writing. So in that, it's not an analysis of another text, it's an analysis of her own craft, but also about the broader world, in the sense that how does the craft or career of a writer relate to another profession or an image that one observes in the sky? Something like that. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's a good example. I have a stack of books below me, and I'm trying to see if what else would relate. But I'll move on to the third category. This was recently added this week, and I'm so glad to expand. My preference would just to be expand and have 10 options for the critical essay, because all of you have such different interests and styles. But for now, we have 3. This is the third. The critical essay can focus on broader social, political, or artistic movements or themes. So this should also include and involve reference to material outside the student's own mind and work, such as interviews, close readings of texts, or other research. So, it can't just be about, I'll just use a contemporary example here. It can't just be an essay about why we should defund the police. Sounds like a really interesting essay to me, but it also, because it has to be following the other formatting guidelines and page length, it has to be similarly involving citations or references to quotes from an interview, research, and preferably maybe something about yourself as a writer or your work. So if you are writing about the movement to defund police, how does that relate to your writing? That's a stretch. This is an example I just came up with, but there are many examples. I'll add that to our list on the whiteboard, but then I'll show you some texts that exemplify this, collections of essays. So, broader themes. What else was I going to write up here? Or movements. Okay, so I have some examples here. This book, I think that we will be reading, I have to look back at the syllabus, but I think that we'll be reading an excerpt of this. If not, I recommend everyone in this course reads the whole book. Truly, it's short. This is by a local author who teaches at UVM. Her name is Emily Bernard. She's brilliant and very kind and supportive of other, her students and other writers, including myself. I'm in a writing group with her, and I really enjoy it. Anyway, this is her recent book of it. I would say it's a collection of essays. It also feels sort of like a memoir, because many of the essays relate to one another, even though they are distinct. But I would say each of these essays in this collection could be considered, and is, a critical essay that exemplifies this third category of broader themes and movements. In that they begin with the personal, and then they move beyond into the political or academic. She writes a lot about being a teacher and having conversations with her students. One essay that I would highly recommend that you start with if you haven't read it is an essay called Teaching with the N-Word, or Teaching the N-Word. which I think it can be found online, and it may be on our syllabus, but if you can read it ahead of time if you want. So it starts off with talking about a little bit about her childhood, and then when she was a student, and then a traumatic experience that happened to her while she was in grad school, and then how that injury of the mind and body and the trauma that she carries forward influences the rest of her life and experience. So the reason why I'm suggesting that it relates to this third option of writing, focusing on broader social, political, artistic movements or themes, is that she writes a lot about race, community, society, politics, and the self, and bodies, trauma, themes that don't necessarily relate to just critical theory or the critical essay or creative writing, moves sort of beyond an intertextual analysis into race and politics and gender and marriage, all sorts of themes. Another book that I think would fit into this category would be Citizen, an American Lyric. And I would call this an essay, a long essay, but the book has been categorized in all sorts of different ways. It's a hybrid essay. It could also be read as a long prose poem. If any of you haven't read this, it's really important. It's an important work. But it is a critique of culture, a critique of American culture and the U.S. and what it means and what it is ruining, taking advantage of, people and groups and families who are disadvantaged or violently attacked. Not a very good summary for the book, meaning it's just don't take my word for it. Read this book. But I would say that it fits into that last category of writing about broader movements and themes. And also, Claudia Rankine in this book does shows us a really good example of what I mean by also including in this last category material outside of the writer's own mind or work. So not just one's ideas or opinions, but also interviews, close readings of texts, quotes, other research. So she includes, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to flip this so you can see it. She includes artwork by other artists, but also there. So most of this is not her artwork. It's other photographers, printmakers, and she cites them all and gives credit where it's due. But she also includes graphs and quotes from articles and television shows and an interview. This is maybe hard to see, but this is an interview that she includes and quotes and gives credit where it's due. So it's not just her writing, she's bringing in sort of a conversation with other thinkers and creators. Another example of this last category would be the givenness of things, Marilynne Robinson, who is one of my favorite authors. She wrote Housekeeping, which is a novel that I think is at the top of my favorites list. But she also writes a lot of essays, and most of her essays, I would say, are philosophical, spiritual, historical. She writes a lot of biblical theory, and I'm not religious, and I wouldn't even necessarily call myself a spiritual person or a spiritual thinker, but I find her essays really interesting because she really digs at that question of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to relate to others? Why do we write, and what does it mean? All sorts of things. And I would say that in all of these, she brings herself in as a character, mostly just as the thinker or a thinker that has some interesting opinions and ideas about these other topics. But she certainly brings in texts and other writers and analyzes them and brings them into her own thought, meaning here's my opinion, here's my thought, here's a theory, but let's refer to other texts. So she sort of exemplifies all three of these, but it's I would say that because they're so philosophical and far-reaching, that they also would fit into that last category of broader themes and movements. Joan Didion, I would say many of Joan Didion's essays would fit into this, in that most of her essays are critical essays. They're critiques of culture, critiques of a city or a person or a business or, all of California or all of America. And she does so in the new journalism style, in the sense that she is a part of the scene and often is a character in these essays. I think so. This particular book was sort of culled from a bunch of notebooks that she was keeping, which included interviews and references to other writers on a road trip and some of her travels. So travel would be another, travel, conversation, interviews, those would fit into what I was suggesting about including other research in that last category. All right, I think that's enough for now. I already had to split my video in half because it was getting so long. We'll talk more about these three approaches in class. And also, I think if you have an idea, run it by me. I think that a lot of other approaches could likely fit in between or within one of these styles, and we'll make it work. So don't worry, we can have fun with this. So in class, we'll talk about the book we're currently reading, The Shapes of Native Nonfiction. I won't dive into that now because we've got to have something to talk about in class. All right, signing off.